Hello, fellow foodies, and welcome back. And thanks for joining us in season 4 of Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious. This week on the show, we're going to get a little wild, exploring the wild food traditions across geographic borders of the Mediterranean, Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and the Middle East. I am absolutely thrilled to have one of my longtime research collaborators and dear friends on the show today, Professor Andrea Pieroni. So let me tell you a little bit about Andrea. Trained in medical botany at the University of Pisa, Professor Pieroni earned his doctorate from the University of Bonn in Germany. He is a full professor at the University of Gastronomic Sciences in Italy, where he also just finished a term as the university rector from 2017 to 2021. Andrea is a past president of the International Society of Ethnobiology and is the founder and chief editor of the very successful scientific journal, the Journal of Ethnobiology and Ethnomedicine. Andrea and I actually started working together 20 years ago on a field expedition in southern Italy when he was a research associate and I was a fresh college graduate. And for any of those of you that have started to read The Plant Hunter, this is the Andrea from the story. So I'm just thrilled to have you on the show. We've come a long way since then. Hey, Andrea, it's great to have you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. It is a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things that I so admire about the work that you've done, in the 20 years since we first met was you've really become a leader in understanding how the movement of peoples, historic diaspora, how those movements influence their food traditions and their ability to survive in new environments. I wonder if we could start there. Maybe tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the fascinating story is that foraging, at least in the Mediterranean and in the Near East, is a phenomenon just starting
Mm,
let's say, predominantly from the Neolithic Revolution. So, to
mm,
understand the foraging patterns in the Mediterranean, we have to understand the trajectory of this phenomenon, which was together with the agriculture and moved together with the agriculture, with farming, many thousand years ago. This is a fascinating story because it tells that the healthy diet of Mediterranean people is actually Iraqi, Lebanese, or Palestinian, or Kurdish, or Syrian, or Turkish, or even Persian. And this is, to me, fascinating. It's fascinating for the perspective in terms of health, but it's also fascinating for the traditions that they are there, especially the cultural heritage, especially the cultural heritage of minorities who may
mm.
see in their tradition as a mean for forging their identity, for being proud, and of course for rural development too.
Yeah. So tell us about some of these places that you've worked. I know
Well,
you've done a lot of work in Italy, but
I
far beyond
started
Italy.
I started
Yeah.
from southern Italy, as you know very well, and then I moved to the Balkans. The Balkans are a place in between, right, between the central Mediterranean and the Near East. And then I moved to the Near East, especially in Kurdistan, and especially in the Mesopotamian plateau, which has been historically an amazing crossroad of cultures, of tolerance, of minorities living together, having completely archaic and different religions. And to see how these beautiful communities use plants, wild plants, still nowadays for food, is really an incredible experience.
Yeah. So what are some of your favorite dishes? I'm thinking let's start with Albania. For me, it's spetzem and maz, the peppers and the yogurt sauce. What's your favorite there?
Well, maybe is nettles or dock. They
Mhm,
represent the filling of pies. This is a very
mhm,
interesting stuff because if we have to remember that the agriculture arrived maybe 6,000 to 7,000 years before Christ in the area. And to make a pie was something that arose from there, but this was the first coupling of using a cereal together with wild plants. At that time, it was impossible to make omelette frittata because the hens arrived just many thousand years later. So this is a very
Oh,
archaic food, the pies with wild vegetables, and the beautiful marriage between the real cereals cultivated and the plants growing around the cereals. We call them wild, but maybe they are semi-domesticated, right? And this an iconic example of healthy diet, of diet where the knowledge of the woman is at the center, is very sustainable because most of these plants are very, very common. It is very rare that these plants put in the pies are threatened.
yeah. So when they're making these pies, I mean, maybe we can use the pie as an example of this kind of, continuum between agricultural fields versus, semi-cultivation versus wild. How do plants fall along that spectrum, and where do what roles do different individuals in the household play in collecting and processing these plants?
Yeah, this is a very interesting point because most of these wild vegetables for the pies are gathered by the woman in the Mediterranean
Mhm,
and also in the Near East. Since these plants normally grow in anthropogenic environments, they are very close to the house, to the village. And the women are also those, they have the knowledge, of course, to process them and to make the pie. So it's really a female part of the diet, which has been also the way through which women in the house were providing care to everyone,
mm,
to the elderly, to the kids, and is health care, is nutritional care, is both. The plants
mhm,
that have been predominantly gathered by men in the Mediterranean come from another kind of root. They are the plants connected to pastoralism. And the
mm.
funny story is that the first plants connected to the female words, the wild vegetables for the pies, have a completely different taste than the plants normally gathered by men in pastoralist disturbed environments.
That's really interesting. I know also that children have different plants that they collect as well as snacks. Is that typical across different cultures where you have different domains that children have special knowledge, that men have different knowledge, and women have different knowledge of plants?
Well, we have not to exaggerate on this division, but surely there is a specific knowledge. Women retain more than men, and vice versa. And
Mm,
kids retain a very interesting interstitial knowledge, which is, by the way, not passed normally vertically, but horizontally. Then
mm,
means is more prone to innovation too. And there are little things kids collect when they play together in the fields. Of course, in a pastoralist context, maybe in the Mediterranean, the Near East, this is more prominent. But I've
mhm.
seen also in the Mesopotamic area, kids are crazy in spring to go around and to chew or to just grab something from nature and have in their mouth. And these consumptions are, of course, very interesting because they are small, tender parts of plants, normally bombs of phenolic acids. And then it's a practice that is, of course, fading because kids knows in many areas of the world their environment less and less.
Yeah, yeah. I always love the ones that they will take for, kind of for taking sweet nectar or kind of sour and sweet flavors, and also plants collected for games, where they'll play, spinning tops or, throw different plants that stick to clothes on each other.
It's
Yeah.
true, it's true. Kids do not go intuitively to bitter plants, because the bitter taste
Mhm.
is a cultural, let's say, development. They have to be around the grannies telling, eat it because it's bitter and it's very healthy for you. So the kids are more prone to collect the stuff which is sweet and especially sour, which
Mhm.
is a very interesting example of how also taste is actually due partially to human ecological trajectories. We don't just eat something because it's edible, but because this is something is making a certain sense in the human ecological trajectory of the practice.
Yeah. Well, that kind of falls into this also this topic of food medicine continuum. And I know this is an area that you've written a lot about as well. Um, you know, how do foods fall along this continuum of food and medicine? And maybe you can start by describing also to the listeners what are medicinal foods versus folk functional foods, and maybe you could give some examples of those.
Well, we have at the time invented this term to distinguish two
Mm,
main phenomena. The first is when a plant is eaten, consumed within a food context in order to obtain a very precise therapeutical effect. I prepare a soup of borage in southern Italy as a depurative or whatever. This is one thing. The second thing is
mm,
when I eat plants, and especially wild food plants, because I want just to be sure I could keep the health. So it's something less precise in terms of therapeutic response, but extremely important, because
mm,
culturally, this kind of niche is not so easy to be transmitted. It's very
mm,
easy to be transmitted the information A is good for B, but A is good needs a more social practice around, and this is what is also very much fading in the Middle East and in the Mediterranean. We need to go back to this idea. We eat things because we think these things can be very healthy for keeping the well-being. So this was
yeah.
the idea of folk functional foods.
I think what else is interesting around folk functional foods is the role of the transformation process. So you're taking whether it's a cultivated or a wild food or a semi-cultivated food, and in some way you're processing it to make it into an edible item, whether it's making a decoction or fermenting things. We've talked a lot about fermentation on the show with folks like Sandor Katz, who's written a lot about some of the ways that foods are transformed. But I'm wondering, what role have you noted in your studies, both in the Balkans but also in the Middle East, around fermentation? How important is that to making these types of foods that are quote unquote good for you?
So fermentation is surely, in my opinion, two main things. One is you have a discontinuity of the resource.
Hmm.
Clearly, you need to preserve the resource in some way. And of course, in the Mediterranean and in the East, the people historically were very lucky because the climate is pretty nice, apart from very horrible summer months, more and more horrible nowadays for climate change. But even there, in the Near East and in the Mediterranean, fermented food is mainly among those populations they had problems in having the resource all over the year. So mountain peoples, for example, the Gorani of the Kosovo and Albania, or even the Yazid, the very,
Hmm.
let's say nowadays, rightly famous Yazid. They have been threatened and killed by ISIS. They have been always living around the Sinjar mountains, and they were very skilled in the Middle East. They were defermenters like the Gorani.
Oh.
And this is one thing. So you have a discontinuity. Some people are more skilled because they live in environments where the discontinuity of the resource is larger. But however, I think also there is another point, that this may be the start, but actually a fermented thing is also something very sexy, very tasty, very
Mhm.
interesting, and can this interest can become also a driver, can be the pleasure to have this taste and to know that this taste and this food is making you feeling better, of course, the health of the good. And so I
Mhm.
think this is also an important point. I mean, populations that were maybe forced to adopt the lactofermentation then turned to be extremely enthusiastic about that. A typical example are Slavs. They would ferment, I
Mm.
would say, everything most of the time. I mean, in the area between Ukraine and Belarus, they really are super professional expert of fermentation. And also Sandor Katz, when he was here, was very fascinated to hear from me the story of Smreka, of the fermented juniper berries in the Balkans, something we have seen very well. And this is now a possible new novel beverage that could be really traded if we would be probably more skilled to get rid of the degradation of the fatty substances they produce
Mm.
a kind of not always wonderful taste, but the sweetish, the sourness, and of course, the aromaticity of juniper berries fermented in water and salt is gorgeous.
It's amazing. I mean, what you're saying too, I think speaks to the thought process behind slow food. And you were rector of the Slow Food University for a number of years, and it's all about celebration of these local foods. And I'm wondering, what can you tell us about that? How your work and your teaching within the university, how does that tie to your research?
Well, to be in a university where you have not to fight for the idea that this
Mm.
local food is important is beautiful. But of
Mhm.
course, is a very, very difficult conundrum because at the end of the day, local communities in many areas of the world are really struggling to keep the food system because of globalization, because it's easier to buy junk foods, because it's easier to adapt to the mainstream. So I think we are in a kind of a very, very crucial crossroad. The interest from the science and also, let's say, the very, very smart consumers is there. But these practices are really disappearing because the political frame, the economical frame are not able to provide these communities the support they would need to, in a way, preserve their food system. Of course, we use the term preserve, but it's always an evolution. But I
Yeah.
see this problem very much, especially in mountain communities. The problems are very similar all over the world, and Slow Food is doing an incredible job, as many other NGOs and citizens, but this is a very difficult task.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is something that's been discussed among ethnobotanists. I mean, for as long as I was aware of the field is around the risks of loss of traditional knowledge, but it seems that it's not just about knowledge loss, it's also about the loss of the practices of this knowledge. I mean, what do you think about that?
Absolutely. I mean, traditional knowledge at the end is little knowledge and a lot of practices. And
Mhm.
if the things are just remembered, is of course better than nothing. But sometimes this is not enough because the practice has to be alive. Of course, a certain practice can be revitalized, but the people should have incentives to do that,
Mhm.
and they should not be abandoned. I just come back from a travel in Albania, which was very disappointing to me. I left Albania 7 years ago with nice projects in the mountains, with slow food, with local peoples, and so on. I came back and I found villages, completely ghost villages. The last
Hmm.
ones, they were doing these things, got the money from these activities and moved to the US. This is also because the relatives in the US, they moved 20 years ago. In the meantime, have the citizenship, and they can, let's say, call the family to them. But the reality is that this beautiful idea and the beautiful experiences just existing in the field 10 years ago do not exist anymore. So it is
Wow.
extremely difficult in the world to make the point that fragile environments like mountains or marginalized environments and the people they live there in a sustainable way needs urgently help and support. But unluckily, in the mountains and marginalized environments, these peoples are very few. That means there are not much voters
Yeah.
who can convince the politicians that these trajectories in planning are very important. So a policy of mountains in the world is non-existing. It's just Austria, Switzerland, very rich countries, they could do whatever, and the rest is the complete abandonment. The same problems from Afghanistan up to Morocco and the Appalachian.
Oh, that's a really good point. That's a really good point. I mean, I think too, a lot of these mountain environments are under a number of different stressors, both climatic, but also stressors from non-sustainable harvest of plants for trade. I think the numbers this year were, I can't remember exactly, but I know it was in the multiple billions of dollars for the dietary supplement industry. And you and I both know, like from these mountains, these are often places where local people are paid very little money to go out and collect these plants for sale as a very small supplement to their income. It's not sustainable for their household income, and it's not sustainable to the environment. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on that, and considering that this is a multi-billion dollar industry, is there more that the dietary supplement industry could be doing to help support these environments, as many of these wild harvested plants come from there?
I don't know. I strongly believe that the work that could be very worth is a grassroots work, because when a
Mhm.
community already open up for big trade, means clearly the community is in trouble.
Mm.
Is economically in trouble. Is I would say in trouble in their souls, and of course is possibly also psychologically very unstable. So when peoples open up for this big scale trade, which will make the situation only worse, there is already a problem there. And I think at the end of the day, NGOs should work together with the communities and also scientists in order to try to find solutions together without taking the easiest and the most shining solution, because most possibly this shining solution is not the right one on long term. Of course, I think the companies are more and more aware of these, and they would also be very sensitive to do something. But they need someone working in the field. The company cannot send
Yeah.
a manager living 3 years in the field. So we need a lot of concerted work, like in a concert. We should play different instruments in a way that makes sense for the conductor.
Oh, that's a really beautiful analogy for it. Yeah. I mean, I think there's so much potential, and some of these places are also biodiversity hotspots. And one of the things I've become more and more passionate about is also not only trying to put communities first, but also thinking about as scientists, we can also help foster research capacity building in these biodiversity hotspots. Because a lot of the scientists in these places just don't have the resources in their universities to undertake the kind of conservation research that's needed.
Is
Yeah.
absolutely important. Is again a concert between the internationals, no matter if NGOs or academicians or scientists, and the national scientists and the local communities. In most of the countries in the world, is still sadly a truth that national scientists know very little about their communities, because they still follow path of science. Sometimes they were modern here 30 years ago. So
Mm.
it is a work of growing together to increase the capacity building of university centers in this country, promoting young people and women, promoting young
Mhm.
people and women is crucial in order to see an academic environment in many countries which is more prone to work together with the communities. But this is also a problem in our very developed, of course, European or American countries. We need young
Yeah.
people, we need humble people, we need women at the forefront. We need to break the structures of an academia which is just sometimes looks like power relations and not nothing else. This is not, of course, every time these, but in some times, and you have, of course, well written also in your book about the snake professors.
Yeah, the snakes and the creepers and all of those characters, unfortunately, that persist. Um, yeah, I think these are such important points, especially yeah, I've really enjoyed the opportunities to work with students from different countries for this reason, and I know you've done so much to lift up students across the world that you've worked with. Well, one other thing I wanted to get into is this topic of resilience. And I think this is something that you really are closely acquainted with from your work with both people that have been, as we discussed, displaced by war or economic strife historically. So these are descendants of people that have been displaced, but also your work with the Yazidi today that have been under threat from within the past decade, attacked. How does that experience influence their resilience in different environments, and what are some of the bits of wisdom that you've gleaned from that work with them?
Well, as you know, this idea was very much linked to the first time we met in
Mhm.
Athens in 2000. And Louisa Maffei and Brent Berlin at that time were working with communities. Louisa Maffei was coming from the school of Raimondo Cardona in Italy. The issue of linguistics in
Mhm.
ethnobiology. Why is so important? Because if we are able to promote minority languages, to promote the cultural heritage of minorities, we promote also their agency in order to present what they have as a value and not be shamed about that. This is
Mm.
a crucial point in minority studies. Minorities are very sensitive and they are very fragile. And sometimes it's not just the war, it's just not the weapon by ISIS, by Daesh, but is the indifference of the world. And I
Mm.
think we need to stay together with the minorities in order to let them also appreciate what they have and try to get another way. For example, for the Yazidi, it has been extremely crucial that the Nobel Prize Committee awarded the Nobel Prize to Nadia Murad, because
Yeah.
this girl who has been raped, who has gone through the hell for months, is now the pride of the community. The money raised by her foundation are funding little projects for revitalize the traditional life around Sinjar, and
Mm.
the community takes the pride to see a possibility for the future. So this is extremely important. We sometimes may think they are completely unrelated things, but they are
Yeah.
extremely related, and minorities deserve our attention. Every time we are indifferent to minorities, we are responsible for killing their culture and killing their phytotherapy, food customs, and so on and so on.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the tragedy is, with the loss of language, with the loss of culture, you're losing millennia of development and richness of as you said, of foods, of medicines, of songs, of art, of ways of knowing and thinking and living. And yeah, I think a world where we only speak one language and a world where we only grow certain 10 crops is a very boring world indeed, and not a very healthy world. I think diversity is incredibly important, um, across the board. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. And each one of these minority could show beautiful cases of use of wild plants. They are very specific and they can become the pride. And I think the issue of bioconservation is always related to the issue of cultural conservation. I don't like the word conservation, but we need also to preserve cultures because they have the language, they have the know-how, they have the traditional knowledge for using local flora, which cannot be killed, because if it is killed, is lost. And we
Yeah.
lose then biodiversity, we lose cultural diversity, and we lose beauty, because diversity is
Mhm.
beauty.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that's really great about your work, Andrea, too, is not only these close connections with different communities, but you've also worked in a diversity of communities with a diversity of groups. And I'm wondering if you can share with us, how do you make those choices of where to work next? How do you plan, your kind of your cycle of research? For any students that are listening, they may be interested in knowing how that works
Well, I
out.
have been always extremely interested in minorities, also actually before Georgia, and
Mm.
I like to know where these specific diasporic group and these minorities live, and so on and so on. And in certain contexts, this is not easy. Even the word minority in certain political context is a highly disputed word, is considered,
Mhm.
let's say, a Western invention for basically making the national business foreigners shouldn't do. For example, my PhD, who has been just finished a PhD working on very, very fragile linguistic minorities at the Hindu Kush, had a hard time to convince the professors in Pakistan that this is quintessential ethnobotany,
Mm.
because of course in many contexts this is considered a political discussion, this is considered something we shouldn't address, not to talk about religious minority. This is even more sensitive.
Mhm.
The issue of a very small religious group, they are even afraid to tell foreigners and strangers um, their beliefs. This is crazy. Ethnobiologists should take the issue of minorities very seriously, because it's fine to have the traditions, but at the end of the day, the traditions are managed by peoples, and these peoples have to be at first proud of what they have.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, those are such great points. And so looking into these diaspora, what do you see as happening in the future? I mean, I guess some of my My kind of doomsday concerns are around loss of biodiversity, loss of linguistic diversity, and also the climate crisis. And as someone that studies displaced peoples, um, what are your thoughts about what's to come with the movement of peoples as basically they lose access to their, historic homelands?
Well, this is a big problem. There are different reasons, of course, behind the moving of people, but in the world,
Mm,
most of the time nowadays, they are not good and positive reasons. The people are
mhm,
forced to move because they are threatened very bad, because they have huge economic problems, because they have wars, because they have climate change in the areas where they come from. So I strongly believe that is important to look at the diasporic groups they have moved, because sometimes
mhm,
these are those they may get in the new environments intuitions, they may
mm,
get also another energy that could be useful for the brothers and sisters remained at home. So just an
mm,
example regarding Albania, the Albanian new cuisine, which is so interesting, sustainable, using local products, is mainly nowadays in the world promoted by chefs in the diaspora. And they have a
mm,
strength and they have an incredible energy. I was just in Pristina and in Tirana. In Pristina, I met Faisal Demirai. Faisal was the sous chef of Noma, the first chef in the world, and is the leader of these gastronomic expeditions,
wow.
and he has such an enthusiastic view regarding what could be done in Kosovo in gastronomy, and his intention is to remain in Kosovo and to live in Kosovo. He grew up in New York and then moved to Noma as Albanian. And the other example in Tirana is, of course, the Kola brothers, Altin Prenga, living for many years abroad. And now the big new chef of Tirana, Bleri Dervishi, just arrived 1 year ago from Italy, and creating an incredible environment for nouvelle cuisine. So the diaspora groups are potentially incredible in their enthusiasm, which could, of course, infect also the ones who are at home. So I think this is one of the key. But of course, we have to be very worried if entire nations are just moving and the countryside are completely abandoned. We have in Europe the big cases of Bulgaria and Romania.
Mm,
Um, basically, they are ghost countries apart from the cities because of economic crisis in the last 20 years. All the people moved to Western Europe and the countryside is completely abandoned, with consequences in terms of geology, in terms of problems when there is some rain, and so on and so on. Sustainable
mm.
management of the territory, which is not easily solvable. That's why we need also the political level to try to keep a balance, because migration is a crazy opportunity. It's a beautiful stuff, even if it starts from horrible reason. But if a whole country migrate, this is also something which is unbalanced.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point, and, the point around also land management, it's not just, the know-how of the land or having people there, but, when we think of even when we think of forests, which many wouldn't consider to be managed, people are managing those forests and those ecosystems, and when you abandon that management, um, yeah, it's not always good. Wow. Well, last question, Andrea, and this is the hardest question, because you have tasted so many amazing things around the world. We talked about the incredible vegetable pies in Albania, but if you could pick any other dish that's kind of new that perhaps listeners haven't heard about before, what could you share with them? What can you tell us about?
Well, one dish which is very, very simple. I'm sorry, it's not much a woman stuff, is more a man stuff, is the
Mhm.
wild rhubarb in Kurdistan. Wild rhubarb in
Yeah.
Kurdistan is like gelato for ice cream for Italians.
Wow.
Everyone in the spring, men, young, old, run up the top of the mountains to collect the stems of rhubarb and wild rhubarb. And they bring in the village, and these wild stems are exchanged, they are enjoyed just with the salt, and they are just snacked communally in the community, in the meal, before the meal, after the meal. So simple and such a beautiful example of commensality, of enjoying together.
That's amazing. What do they taste like? Is it kind of crunchy or
Yeah,
is
it's
it?
very interesting. It's of course crunchy and a little bit
Mhm.
of sour, but if you are very skilled, the same species, but to grab the right spot, you can have also sweetish notes, even rose note. And if you are really
Wow.
very skilled, you can even, in a way, tame the rubber bar. You bring some stuff from home, and you try to protect the fleshy stems. And after 1 week, these fleshy stems are whitish and bigger and thicker and crunchier. And this is
Wow.
also a kind of taming in the wild. But the
Wow.
most important thing is that this snack, differently from the normal snacks, are not eaten on the spot, but are just eaten together and discussing and also sometimes singing and dancing. Is a
Wow.
beautiful example of how simple can be a recipe. Just raw stems of wild rhubarb.
That's great. So, sorry, listeners, this is not something you can run to the grocery store to get. You got to run up a mountain in Kurdistan and get. But if you get to one of those villages at the right time of year, maybe you'll get a chance to share it. I may have to add that to my bucket list of places to go with you someday, Andrea.
Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you for coming on this show. It's been wonderful to talk with you.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah. You've been listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious. You can find this episode and all of our others at foodiepharmacology.com. You can also find us streaming on all of your favorite podcast streaming services. I want to give a shout out of thanks to our producers, to Rob Cohen and Christine Roth, and a very special thanks to you, our listeners, for tuning in. We're now on season 4, and I'm so excited the show is still going on. Stay healthy out there, and I'll see you next time.